Hi, I'm Lee and I'm here from the Belfast Oyster Experience to tell you a bit about oysters and what they mean to us and why we feel they should be celebrated here in Ireland. Oysters are something that we specialise in at the Belfast Oyster Experience. We run tours where we would do a shucking demonstration for our customers, but I'm going to do a demonstration online for you guys today and explain a bit about oysters and how they work and how they're grown. They're grown very well here in Northern Ireland, and I'll go into a bit about the biology of oysters and how they work as well. So what we've got here, folks, is these are Killock Bay oysters. These are grown just in Killock Bay, which is just after Strangford in County Down, just on the east coast of Ireland. These oysters in particular are what you would call a rock oyster or Pacific oyster. These can be grown anywhere in the world. They're very, very versatile, but the reason that they grow so well here in this country is because of the extremely cold water temperatures here. It's one of the benefits of being very cold here at times in Ireland. The colder the water for the oyster, these in particular, the more meaty and the more flavoursome the actual meat is in the oyster. So, going into a bit about the life cycle of these oysters and how they work. These are imported as a baby oyster, right about the size of 2 millimetres or 1 millimetres from France. They're referred to as a spat, is the name for a baby oyster. They are made in hatcheries or created in hatcheries in France and flown in here, and they are set in the shoreline in Killock, which is a place where you have what you would call brackish water. Brackish means when you have seawater which is being met with fresh water. There's a few ways that can happen, but Killock has the benefit of the fresh water coming from Strangford meeting the seawater, which makes it a perfect environment to grow oysters. These oysters have a lifespan of around 3 years. These ones in particular were harvested around the 2-year mark. What happens is when they come into the country as a spat or a baby oyster, they're placed into large bags. The oysters themselves are what you would refer to as a filter feeder. So these oysters open and close in the water, and they can filter up to 50 litres of water per day, meaning that they're actually a sustainable food, they're good for the environment, and they're actually healthy for us as well. These oysters in particular are taken and shaken in the bag on a weekly or bi-weekly basis by the family that farm these oysters in Killock. The family that we buy these oysters through are the owners of Lecale Harvest, and they produce some really good different types of food in and around the Ballynahinch and County Down areas and farm these particular oysters in Killock. What a lot of people don't know about oysters is that these are a particularly healthy food. Oysters are full of vitamins. One of the main vitamins that oysters have is a vitamin zinc, which is known to create an increase in testosterone levels in both males and females, which is why oysters get the reputation of becoming an aphrodisiac type food. Unfortunately, to achieve a level where oysters become an aphrodisiac, you would need to eat around 10 dozen of these, which we don't tend to do. These are normally served by the half dozen, or myself, I prefer a dozen oysters. What the oysters have as well, which a lot of people aren't aware of, is quite a high amount of protein. These particular oysters have somewhere between 3 and 5 grams of protein, which is quite a substantial amount. If you consider the size of these, when the normal chicken breast would have between 30 and 40 grams of protein, a few of these can easily make up the same amount of protein as a chicken breast. They're particularly good for people who exercise and are looking for a high protein diet. What a lot of people aren't aware of is that oysters are a food which is synonymous with Belfast, which is why we felt compelled to create the Belfast Oyster Experience, because they have a history in and around the Belfast area. Directly after the time of the famine, whenever Belfast was a real industrial boomtown, many people emigrated from around Ireland to settle in Belfast to get jobs in industry, in the factories and the textiles and mills which were so prolific in Belfast at the time. What a lot of people don't know is that oysters are a food which is quite synonymous with Belfast and is something which has been eaten in Belfast for many centuries. Oysters at that time were seen as the food of the working class, and how we got oysters in Belfast was because there was a group of people known as the Fadgies who had came up to Belfast from a place called Omeath and had settled in an area which is currently known as Smithfield Market, and where Castle Court in Belfast is. What these people done was they were the importers and sellers of food, which was from around Ireland. They would have done the likes of travel to Armagh to get apples and travelled to County Down to get seafood, these oysters in particular. What these people done to sell these products was they brought the products around door to door in a wheelbarrow, and these were sold to the working class. These were the food of the working class and were often in a worker's lunchbox to be had as part of their lunch, with a shucking knife in the lunchbox as well. Where we hold the Belfast Oyster Experience, which is based in Kelly's Cellars, the building directly beside Kelly's, when they were building the new building and renovating that building, in the foundations, when they dug the foundations, they had actually found oyster shells, which were from the lunchboxes of the workers in that area at the time. There are certain areas also in England where there are so many oyster shells that they are actually used in foundations to enhance the structural integrity, the shells of the building. There are many different ways that you can eat oysters. The more common is to eat them fresh. These oysters are taken from the sea and are put into what's called a depurification tank, where the oysters are put under a UV light and oxidated for 48 hours. That is a legal requirement, so these can now be eaten fresh with no real risk of illness. What we would do is open the oyster by using what's called a shucking knife. This is one here. And what we would be doing, oysters, as I explained before, are what you would call a bivalve mollusk, meaning they have two muscles, one here and one at the bottom. These muscles are used to open and close the oyster to allow the oyster to feed. The good thing is that these oysters are difficult to open because they're still alive, they're extremely fresh, and there's a certain amount of resistance that the oyster has from being opened. But what we intend to do is use this knife to pop the oyster open and let you guys see how to eat a fresh oyster. So what we do is we tuck the oyster into this towel to provide a bit of a guard and a bit of extra stability. And what we do is we place the knife into this hinge or knuckle of the oyster. We apply a certain amount of pressure, and then we would apply a clockwise twist to the knife, usually resulting in the oyster popping open. So, okay, now that's the first step. And what we've got to do from this point, you're okay to remove your towel at this point. We are looking to sever the adductor muscle at the very top of the oyster shell. So we'll apply a bit more pressure. And we now have this muscle separated. Okay, and we have our oyster. Now, you may notice a liquid in the oyster. We would refer to that as the liquor. A fun fact about oysters is that they can regenerate this liquor, and a really good oyster like these can regenerate this liquor up to 5 times. So what I generally do, if someone's new to oysters, is I allow this liquor to generate and I'll pour that out, meaning in a less intense flavour from the oyster. Somebody like myself that really likes the flavour of oysters, I encourage that, and I want to keep this liquor. So what I would do, generally after this, is we want to lift the oyster, and there's a muscle at the bottom. We want to attempt to sever that muscle to allow the oyster to be free in the shell. So what I'll do is generally cut this muscle, and then what we would do after this is flip the oyster for presentation. Any restaurant that you go to where you would buy oysters, they would generally be served to you flipped for presentation. And you can see there, guys, that when that's done, we have a much better looking product there. Now, in terms of dressing the oyster, a lot of people prefer the oyster either on its own, with a squeeze of lemon can really enhance the flavour of the oyster, or as you can see in the Belfast Oyster Experience, we use a lot of different sauces here. Generally, the hotter or more spicy the sauce, it tends to go very well with the briny flavour of the oyster, and the brininess of the oyster can be really altered depending on which type of sauce you use. So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to have this one fresh with a squeeze of lemon, and then we're going to look at dressing an oyster. The majority of oysters that are grown here in Ireland are not to be sold in Ireland, but they are for the export trade. A lot of the exports go to France, China, but they're enjoyed in all cultures around the world. So we hope that you enjoy oysters. We would recommend that you try them at home. All you would need to do is purchase oysters at a local fishmonger, and you can purchase an oyster knife at any good cookery shop. You can have these at home. And we recommend that you give them a try. Thank you for joining me, Lee, and the Belfast Oyster Experience at this year's virtual Mela. Sorry we can't be there in person. We will be there next year, and we hope to try some oysters with you all. Feel free to comment below this video if you've tried oysters and different ways that you may enjoy them yourselves. We always want to learn from people in different cultures about how they're enjoyed around the world. Another good way that we like to enjoy them ourselves is Rockefeller Style, which we'd highly recommend too. This is a cooked way of enjoying oysters, where the oysters are mixed with the spinach and cream sauce, garlic, breadcrumb and hard cheese. Let us know if you've tried this or if there's any other recommendations you guys may have, but we'll see you next year in person.